There are two islands in Southeast Asia, separated by a stretch of water so narrow you can see one from the shore of the other. The distance between them is about 35 kilometers, a short boat ride, an easy crossing. On one side, tigers, elephants, and animals you'd recognize from mainland Asia. On the other side, none of them. Not one. Instead, creatures that belong to a completely different world, animals more at home in Australia than anywhere near Asia. Same latitude, same climate, same kind of forest, just 35 kilometers of water between them, and yet, for millions of years, nothing has crossed. A man named Alfred Russel Wallace was the first to notice this, not from a comfortable laboratory, but from years of island hopping through the archipelago, collecting specimens, recording what lived where, watching a pattern emerge that no one had ever documented before. He worked it out entirely from fieldwork, decades before science had the tools to explain why it was happening. What he found was an invisible line, not drawn on any map, not marked by any mountain or wall, running through the water between islands, separating two biological worlds that should, by every visible measure, have blended together long ago. No one in his time could explain it, and the explanation, when it finally came, revealed something about the deep history of this planet that changed how scientists understood life on Earth. Tonight, we follow that line. But before we continue, if you feel comfortable sharing, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from today, and what is the time over there? It's always a joy to see many people across different time zones falling asleep to these deep-sea stories. Let's continue. The journals did not begin with certainty, only with small, careful entries made at the edge of unfamiliar shores. Ink pressed into paper under humid air, each line capturing fragments of a world that seemed, at first, endlessly varied, yet loosely connected. Alfred Russel Wallace moved through these islands, not as a conqueror of knowledge, but as a patient observer, allowing patterns to reveal themselves slowly through repetition and time. He arrived in Southeast Asia during the 1800s, when much of the region remained only lightly described by European science. Travel unfolded in stages measured by tides and weather, by the reliability of boats and the willingness of local guides. Each island offered its own collection of forms, wings folded in quiet forests, insects resting beneath leaves, mammals slipping through dense undergrowth. Wallace gathered them with steady hands, preserving birds, cataloging beetles, noting shapes and colors with an attention that bordered on devotion. Days blended into one another, filled with the rhythm of searching and recording. He did not yet seek a grand theory. Instead, he followed the quiet discipline of accumulation, trusting that understanding would emerge from enough careful observations. Boxes of specimens grew heavier with each crossing, but it was not their weight that mattered. It was their differences, subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced. Somewhere along these journeys, the continuity began to fracture. The shift did not announce itself with spectacle. It arrived quietly, almost easily missed, like a change in the tone of a forest. On one island, the animals aligned with familiar patterns of mainland Asia. Monkeys moved through the canopy. Birds carried forms and colors that echoed distant continents, and insects resembled those collected hundreds of kilometers away. Then, after a short passage across open water, everything altered. The new island did not feel entirely foreign at a glance. The trees stood just as tall, the air carried the same warmth, and the soil held the same deep scent of life. Yet the creatures within it belonged to another story. Birds bore unfamiliar shapes, mammals followed different designs, and even the insects seemed drawn from an alternate lineage. It was not a gradual transition, it was abrupt, almost sharp, as if an unseen boundary had been crossed without warning. Wallace did not dismiss the observation as coincidence. He returned to it, again and again, comparing notes, revisiting earlier records, aligning specimens side by side. The pattern held firm. Islands separated by narrow stretches of water carried entirely different communities of life. The distance was small enough that one shore could sometimes be seen from the other, yet the biological divide remained absolute. He understood that such a change could not be explained by chance alone. Random variation would blur edges, allowing species to mix and overlap. What he observed instead was a line of separation, precise and persistent, cutting through the region with a consistency that demanded explanation. In his notes, the idea began to take shape, not as a bold declaration, but as a quiet recognition. There existed a boundary that no map had drawn, one that did not follow mountains or rivers, but something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of the world itself. He traced it cautiously, marking where the shift occurred, island by island, letting the evidence guide him rather than forcing it into expectation. The realization did not arrive all at once. It formed gradually through the accumulation of crossings, each journey reinforcing what the last had suggested. By the time he committed it more clearly to paper, the pattern had already become undeniable. What Wallace recorded in those early notes was not just a curiosity of distribution. It was the outline of a division that spoke of ancient separations, of histories written long before human observation. He had not yet uncovered the reason, but he had revealed the presence of something profound, an invisible structure shaping life across the islands, waiting patiently for its deeper story to be understood. From above, the region appears as a scattered chain of green fragments resting on a vast blue surface, each island separated by narrow bands of water that seem almost incidental. This is Indonesia, a place where land is divided into thousands of pieces, yet held together by proximity, climate, and shared position along the equator. The distances between many of these islands are modest, sometimes so small that the horizon carries the outline of another shore within easy sight. In such a landscape, continuity would be the natural expectation. When land lies this close together, life usually spreads without restraint. Animals move, seeds travel, and ecosystems blend over time, softening any distinctions that once existed. Forests extend their influence across water, carried by wind, currents, and the quiet persistence of generations. The boundaries between islands in most parts of the world become blurred through this slow exchange. Early naturalists assumed the same would hold true here. The climate remains steady across the archipelago, shaped by the same warm air and seasonal rains. The vegetation shares familiar structures, dense canopies, layered understories, and the constant presence of moisture. From a distance, nothing suggests division. The environment appears continuous, as though the islands are fragments of a single, larger landscape gently pulled apart. Yet the living details resist this expectation. On certain islands, the animals carry the unmistakable imprint of Asia. Mammals move with forms that echo distant continental forests. Primates with grasping hands, large herbivores adapted to thick vegetation, predators shaped by long-established ecological roles. The birds align with these patterns as well, their calls and plumage reflecting a lineage tied to the north and west. Even the smaller creatures, the reptiles and insects, follow this same inheritance, forming a web of life that feels connected to a broader mainland history. Then, across a relatively narrow stretch of water, the pattern dissolves. The neighboring island does not gradually shift into something new. Instead, it presents a distinct world, one that aligns not with Asia, but with Australia. Marsupials take the place of familiar mammals, their forms shaped by entirely different evolutionary paths. Birds display traits that belong to distant southern lands, and the absence of certain groups becomes as noticeable as the presence of others. The ecological structure remains full and balanced, yet its components have been rearranged into something fundamentally different. This contrast does not soften with distance. It appears suddenly, holding its clarity even where the gap between islands is small. The expected blending never occurs. There is no gradual mixing zone where species overlap and transition. Instead, there is a boundary, invisible but precise, where one biological identity gives way to another. The realization carries a quiet weight. Geography suggests unity, yet life insists on separation. The islands sit close enough to share weather, light, and the steady rhythm of equatorial seasons, but their inhabitants remain divided into distinct communities. It is as though an unseen hand has drawn a line through the archipelago, one that living organisms recognize even if it cannot be seen or touched. Scientists began to understand that proximity alone does not guarantee connection. Movement across water, even over short distances, depends on more than the ability to travel. It depends on history, on barriers hidden beneath the surface, and on conditions that either allow or prevent the slow spread of life. In this region, something deeper than distance governs the arrangement. The pattern reveals itself not as an anomaly, but as a consistent rule, repeated from island to island with quiet certainty. Two worlds exist side by side, shaped by different origins, maintained by forces that are not immediately visible. The closeness of the islands only sharpens the contrast, turning what might have been overlooked into something unmistakable. In the stillness of this arrangement, the archipelago becomes more than a collection of landforms. It becomes a map of separation, where the surface tells one story, and the living world tells another, each island holding its place within a boundary that remains unseen, yet deeply felt. Cartographers can draw it in a single stroke, a thin curve threading through the islands. Yet the line itself does not belong to ink or paper. It exists only through what lives on either side, revealed by presence and absence, rather than by any visible mark upon the sea. This is the Wallace Line, a boundary that follows no ridge or shoreline, yet can be traced with surprising precision across the Indonesian archipelago. Its path moves between islands that appear, at first glance, closely connected. It slips between Bali and Lombok, where the distance is modest and the waters narrow. It continues northward, passing between Borneo and Sulawesi, weaving through channels that do not announce themselves as barriers. To the eye, these separations seem no more significant than countless others scattered across the region. Yet, along this particular path, the pattern of life shifts with remarkable consistency. The line does not run straight. It bends and adjusts, following the contours of something deeper than geography alone. Rather than slicing the archipelago into equal halves, it curves in response to underlying structures, aligning with forces that lie beneath the surface. Each turn reflects a hidden logic, one that becomes visible only when mapped against the distribution of species. On one side of this boundary, the assemblage of life reflects a history tied to the great landmass of Asia. On the other, it aligns with Australia and its surrounding regions. The division remains clear. Even where islands draw close, even where distances shrink to what might seem easily crossed, the line does not drift or fade in these narrow passages. It holds its position, as though anchored to something far more stable than the shifting surface of the sea. To understand its course, one must look beyond the visible arrangement of land. The archipelago is not a uniform platform but a mosaic of geological fragments, each with its own origin and depth. Beneath certain channels, the ocean floor plunges steeply, forming deep water passages that have persisted for vast stretches of time. These submerged features guide the path of the line, shaping where it bends and where it remains firm. Because of this, The Wallace Line is not defined by distance alone. Two islands may lie close together, yet if a deep channel separates them, the boundary remains intact. In other places, where shallower seas once connected land during periods of lower sea levels, the line shifts accordingly. Its shape reflects a long history of changing oceans and drifting continents, recorded not in rock alone, but in the living patterns that have endured. This is why the line resists simplification. It cannot be reduced to a straight division or a single coordinate. It is a boundary that emerges from interaction, from the relationship between land, sea, and time. Each segment of its path tells part of that story, linking present distributions to ancient separations. Seen in this way, the Wallace Line becomes less like a border and more like a trace, a quiet record of where different worlds have met but not merged. It threads through the islands without altering their appearance, leaving coastlines unchanged and forests uninterrupted. Only the living inhabitants reveal its presence, each species marking its side with silent consistency. The archipelago, when viewed through this lens, takes on a new coherence. What once seemed like a scattered arrangement of islands becomes a structured landscape, divided not by visible barriers, but by histories that continue to shape the present. The line moves through it all, unseen yet precise, defining a boundary that exists entirely within the fabric of life itself. Names begin to gather along the boundary, not as a list, but as a quiet procession of lives that hold their ground on either side. Each species carries with it a long inheritance, a set of forms shaped by distant histories, and along this unseen division, those histories remain separated with remarkable consistency. On the western side, the presence of Asia expresses itself through familiar structures of movement and survival. Primates move through the upper layers of the forest, their limbs adapted for grasping and balance, their lives woven into the complexity of branches and fruiting trees. Among them are macaques and leaf monkeys, each shaped by generations that unfolded across vast continental landscapes. Along the forest floor and within its shadows, larger forms appear, animals built for strength and endurance. Elephants move with quiet weight, their paths etched into the terrain through repeated passage. In deeper cover, big cats such as tigers occupy their place within the balance of predator and prey, their forms refined by long evolutionary pressures. These species do not appear in isolation. They exist within ecosystems that reflect a shared origin, where mammals with placental development dominate, and where ecological roles have been filled through a continuity that extends far beyond the islands themselves. The patterns feel cohesive, as though each species belongs to a larger, interconnected system that stretches toward the mainland. Then, across the boundary, the arrangement shifts completely. The eastern side holds a different expression of life, one that traces its lineage to Australia and regions beyond. Marsupials take on roles that, elsewhere, are filled by placental mammals. Tree kangaroos move through the canopy with a balance that echoes distant relatives, adapted to open land, yet reshaped for forest life. Smaller marsupials occupy niches that mirror those of rodents or small primates, yet their biology follows an entirely different path, one defined by early birth and extended development within a pouch. Among the most distinctive inhabitants are monotremes, rare and ancient, represented by species such as the echidna. These animals carry traits that seem to belong to an earlier chapter of mammalian evolution, their presence reinforcing the sense that this side of the boundary follows a separate narrative. Birdlife also reflects this divergence, with species like cockatoos and birds of paradise displaying forms and behaviors not found to the west, their lineage tied to a different evolutionary heritage. What becomes most striking is not only the presence of these distinct groups, but the absence of overlap between them. The primates that define one side do not extend into the other. The marsupials that characterize the east do not appear in the west. Elephants, tigers, and many other large mammals reach a limit and stop, their range ending abruptly at the boundary. In the opposite direction, the unique fauna of the eastern islands does not move beyond its own side. This absence holds steady even where geography suggests it should not. The distance between certain islands remains small, close enough that the idea of crossing seems entirely plausible. Yet over countless generations, the separation persists. Each side retains its identity, its species remaining within the bounds set by forces that do not announce themselves on the surface. The line, though invisible, becomes clear through these living patterns. It is marked not by what can be seen in the landscape, but by what appears and what does not. Each species, in its quiet adherence to one side, contributes to the definition of the boundary, reinforcing it without intention or awareness. In this arrangement, the archipelago reveals a deeper structure, one that exists within the distribution of life itself. The animals, through their presence and absence, trace a division that has endured across immense spans of time, holding two biological worlds apart, even as they rest side by side within the same ocean. At certain shorelines, the separation feels almost negligible, as though the next island could be reached with little more than a steady current and a clear day. The outline of land rises just beyond the water, close enough to anchor the gaze, close enough to suggest continuity rather than division. These neighboring islands rest within sight of one another, their coasts shaped by the same tides, their horizons shared beneath the same sky. From this vantage, it becomes difficult to imagine any meaningful barrier between them. The water that lies between appears calm and passable, a narrow stretch that seems unlikely to resist the slow, persistent movements of life. Over generations, animals are expected to expand their ranges, seeds to drift and take root, and ecosystems to extend outward in gradual waves. Proximity, in most places, encourages connection. It allows the blending of species, the soft merging of boundaries, until distinctions fade into a continuous whole. Yet here, that expectation dissolves. On one island, the arrangement of life follows a pattern already established, shaped by a lineage that carries its own history. Across the water, on the neighboring shore, the composition shifts entirely. The forest may stand with similar density, the ground may carry the same warmth, but the creatures that move within it belong to a different narrative. The transition is not gradual, not softened by overlap or shared presence. It is immediate, as though the crossing of water marks an invisible threshold. The closeness of these islands sharpens the contrast. When landforms are separated by vast distances, differences in life can be understood as a consequence of isolation. But when the gap narrows to a span that can be seen with the naked eye, the persistence of such a divide becomes more difficult to reconcile with ordinary expectations. Movement across this distance appears entirely possible, yet over immense stretches of time, it has not led to the blending one might anticipate. Part of the explanation lies in the nature of movement itself. For many animals, crossing open water is not a simple extension of their range. It requires a convergence of conditions that rarely align: calm seas, favorable currents, and the absence of predators or exhaustion. Even for species capable of swimming or drifting, survival during such a passage remains uncertain. A short distance on a map can represent a profound challenge in practice, one that limits the frequency and success of crossings. For smaller organisms, the journey may seem more achievable, carried by wind or floating debris. Yet even these forms of dispersal are shaped by chance rather than certainty. Arrival does not guarantee establishment. The new environment must support survival, offering suitable resources and conditions that align with the needs of the species. Without this alignment, even successful crossings leave no lasting trace. Over time, these limitations accumulate. Rare events may occur, individuals may reach new shores, but the establishment of stable populations requires more than occasional arrival. It demands continuity, the repeated success of survival and reproduction across generations. Where such continuity fails to take hold, the boundary remains intact, reinforced not by a single barrier, but by the consistent outcome of many small constraints. The result is a pattern that feels almost paradoxical. Islands that seem close enough to share their living communities instead maintain distinct identities, each shaped by its own history and limits. The water between them, though narrow, becomes a space where possibilities diminish, where the flow of life slows and, in many cases, stops entirely. In this quiet separation, the archipelago reveals a subtle truth. Distance alone does not define connection. The ease of movement depends on conditions that are not always visible, and the spread of life follows pathways that are shaped as much by limitation as by opportunity. Neighboring islands may appear linked by proximity, yet within the deeper patterns of nature, they can remain worlds apart, their differences held in place by forces that operate quietly, but with enduring effect. Wings suggest freedom, a quiet promise that distance can be folded away with enough lift and patience. In many parts of the world, birds dissolve boundaries that hold other animals in place, tracing wide arcs across continents and seas, carrying life between regions that would otherwise remain separate. Their movement feels unrestrained, guided by currents of air rather than the limits of land. Within this archipelago, that expectation begins to soften. Birds are present on both sides of the unseen boundary, filling forests with motion and sound, yet their distributions remain aligned with the same division that shapes creatures bound to the ground. The ability to fly does not dissolve the pattern. Instead, it reveals that movement alone is not enough to erase it. Some species travel across considerable distances, following seasonal rhythms or shifting in response to changing conditions. Their wings carry them over open water with apparent ease, and from above, the separation between islands seems even less significant. Yet these journeys often remain within established ranges, guided by instinct and familiarity rather than exploration into entirely new territories. For many birds, habitat defines their limits as clearly as any physical barrier. Each species is adapted to specific conditions, particular combinations of vegetation, food sources, and nesting environments. Even when another island lies within reach, it may not offer what is needed for survival. A forest that appears similar from a distance can differ in subtle but critical ways, altering the availability of resources or the presence of competitors and predators. These ecological preferences shape movement in ways that are not immediately visible. A bird may be capable of crossing the water, yet if the destination does not align with its needs, the journey holds little advantage. Over time, this selectivity reinforces the boundary, not through inability, but through the quiet consistency of where species choose to remain. Behavior also plays a role, guiding patterns of flight that favor known routes and established territories. Many birds exhibit strong site fidelity, returning to familiar areas for feeding and breeding. Their movements, though capable of spanning great distances, often follow predictable paths that do not intersect with the boundary in a way that leads to lasting change. Crossing may occur, but without the establishment of a stable population, such events leave only fleeting traces. Even among those species that do appear on both sides, subtle differences emerge. Populations separated by the boundary may diverge over time, shaped by the distinct conditions of their environments. Plumage may shift, calls may change, and behaviors may adapt to local circumstances, creating variations that reflect the underlying division. The line remains present, not as an absolute barrier, but as a guiding influence that shapes the direction of change. The persistence of this pattern suggests that flight, while powerful, does not override the deeper structures at work. Movement across space must be matched by the ability to persist within it. Without that continuity, the act of crossing becomes temporary, a moment rather than a transformation. In this way, birds reveal a more nuanced understanding of boundaries. They demonstrate that the limits of life are not always defined by physical constraints alone, but by the interplay of behavior, ecology, and long-term adaptation. The sky offers passage, but it does not guarantee belonging. As wings move through the air above these islands, the boundary remains quietly in place below, traced not by what can be seen, but by the patterns that endure. Each species, in its chosen range, contributes to the shape of that invisible line, showing that even in a world where flight is possible, the distribution of life continues to follow paths shaped by forces that extend far beyond the reach of wings. In the quiet layers beneath leaves and along the delicate surfaces of branches, another record of the boundary unfolds, one that does not rely on size or strength, but on repetition and detail. Insects move through these spaces with a constant, almost unbroken presence, their lives brief yet numerous, their generations unfolding in rapid succession. If any group might be expected to blur distinctions between islands, it would be these small, persistent travelers. Butterflies drift through the air with a lightness that suggests ease, their wings catching sunlight as they pass from one patch of forest to another. Beetles move more slowly, grounded in bark and soil, yet equally widespread, their diversity extending into countless forms. Together, they create a tapestry of movement and color that seems capable of crossing any narrow separation. Yet the pattern holds. On one side of the unseen boundary, butterfly species carry distinct arrangements of color and structure, their markings aligned with lineages that extend across regions tied to Asia. Their forms repeat with variation, but within a recognizable framework, one that links them to distant populations through shared traits. Beetles follow a similar path, their shapes and behaviors reflecting a continuity that stretches beyond the immediate landscape. Across the boundary, the arrangement shifts once again. Butterfly species display different combinations of color and wing pattern, their structures shaped by separate evolutionary histories. Beetles too reveal a divergence, their forms adapted along lines that do not overlap with those found to the west. The distinction is not always obvious at a glance, but it becomes clear through careful comparison, through the accumulation of many small differences that align consistently with the same division. What makes this especially striking is the scale at which it occurs. Insects, unlike larger animals, possess the ability to disperse in ways that seem less constrained. Some are carried by wind, lifted into the air, and transported across distances without effort of their own. Others drift on floating vegetation or move gradually through successive generations, expanding their range step by step. The opportunities for crossing appear abundant, woven into the very nature of their existence. And yet, the boundary remains intact. The explanation lies not only in movement, but in what follows after arrival. For an insect to establish itself in a new location, it must find the precise conditions that support its survival. Many species are closely tied to specific host plants, relying on them for feeding or reproduction. If those plants are absent, the insect cannot persist, no matter how easily it may have arrived. In this way, the distribution of plants becomes intertwined with the distribution of insects, creating layers of dependency that reinforce the separation. Climate also shapes these patterns in subtle ways. Slight differences in rainfall, temperature, or seasonal rhythm can influence development, timing, and survival. Over generations, these factors guide adaptation, aligning species with the conditions of their environment. When those conditions shift across the boundary, even slightly, they contribute to the maintenance of distinct communities. Time deepens these divisions. With each generation, populations that remain separated accumulate changes, responding to their local surroundings in ways that gradually set them apart. The boundary becomes more than a line of separation. It becomes a space where divergence is preserved and amplified. Even when occasional crossings occur, they rarely lead to lasting integration, as the conditions on each side continue to favor the established forms. Insects, through their abundance and diversity, provide a detailed map of this process. Their patterns mirror the larger divisions seen in birds and mammals, but with a finer resolution, revealing how deeply the boundary is embedded in the fabric of life. Each species, in its distribution, traces a history of movement and limitation, of opportunity shaped by constraint. Within these small lives, the larger story becomes clearer. The invisible divide is not dependent on size or mobility. It persists because it is supported by a network of relationships, by environmental conditions, and by the steady influence of time. Even at the smallest scale, the separation endures, carried quietly within the wings of butterflies and the forms of beetles, marking a boundary that remains unseen, yet unmistakably present. Beneath the quiet surface of the water, far below the reach of light, the shape of the seafloor tells a story that cannot be seen from above. What appears as a narrow stretch between islands conceals a sudden descent, where the ocean floor drops away into deep channels that cut through the region with silent permanence. These submerged passages lie between islands that seem close in distance, yet the depth between them creates a separation far more profound than their surface proximity suggests. In many parts of the world, shallow seas connect neighboring lands, forming gentle shelves that extend outward from the coastline. During periods when sea levels fall, these shelves can emerge, linking islands into continuous stretches of land. Such connections allow animals to move freely, spreading across regions that would otherwise remain isolated. Over time, this process blends ecosystems, creating continuity across space. Here, the structure is different. Between certain islands, the seafloor does not rise into a shallow shelf. Instead, it plunges into depths that remain submerged even when sea levels drop significantly. These channels, shaped over immense spans of geological time, form barriers that persist through changing climates and shifting coastlines. While the surface may suggest a brief crossing, the underlying depth ensures that no land bridge has ever formed to connect these islands. This distinction carries lasting consequences for the movement of life. Without a continuous path of land, terrestrial animals are unable to migrate across these divides in the gradual, generational way that shapes distribution elsewhere. The opportunity for expansion is not entirely absent, but it becomes rare and uncertain, dependent on events that occur infrequently and often without lasting effect. The depth of these channels also influences the character of the surrounding environment. Water moves differently over steep underwater slopes, currents shifting in ways that can either carry organisms or prevent their passage. The seafloor, though hidden, guides these movements, shaping the flow of nutrients, the distribution of marine life, and the conditions at the surface. These factors, in turn, affect the broader ecosystems of the islands themselves, reinforcing the separation already imposed by the lack of land connection. When viewed in this context, distance becomes a less meaningful measure of isolation. Two islands may lie close together, separated by only a few dozen kilometers, yet if a deep channel lies between them, the separation becomes effectively complete. In contrast, islands farther apart but connected by shallow seas may share a history of continuity, their ecosystems shaped by periods of direct connection. The Wallace Line follows this hidden topography with quiet precision. Its path aligns with these deep water boundaries, tracing the edges of submerged features that have remained stable over vast periods of time. While the surface of the region has changed, with coastlines shifting and sea levels rising and falling, the deeper structure has persisted, maintaining the separation that defines the boundary. This underlying framework reveals that the division between biological worlds is not arbitrary. It is rooted in the physical shape of the planet, in the contours that lie beneath the ocean's surface. The line is not drawn across the water at random, but follows a pattern set by geological history, one that continues to influence the distribution of life. In the stillness of these depths, the boundary finds its foundation. The ocean, often seen as a space of connection, becomes here a quiet barrier, its unseen structure guiding the arrangement of ecosystems above. The islands remain close in appearance, yet beneath them, the seafloor holds a different truth, one that has shaped the living world for millions of years without ever revealing itself to the eye. There were times when the shape of the world shifted quietly, not through sudden upheaval, but through the slow accumulation of cold. Ice gathered across vast northern lands, locking away immense volumes of water, and as it did, the level of the oceans began to fall. Coastlines extended outward, revealing ground that had long been hidden beneath shallow seas. What had once been separate became joined, and the map of Earth redrew itself in subtle, expansive ways. Across many regions, these changes created broad land bridges. Continents that now stand apart were once connected by corridors of exposed earth, allowing animals to move between them over generations. Forests and grasslands spread into these newly revealed spaces, and with them came the gradual migration of species. Boundaries softened, ecosystems blended, and life extended its reach into areas that had previously been isolated by water. In the Indonesian archipelago, the transformation followed a different pattern. As sea levels fell, many of the islands on the western side became connected, forming a continuous landmass that stretched toward the Asian mainland. This extended region, known as the Sunda Shelf, allowed animals to move freely across what are now separate islands. The forests expanded over this exposed terrain, carrying with them the species that defined the ecosystems of that side. Movement was not immediate, but over long periods, it became steady and cumulative, reinforcing a shared biological identity. To the east, a similar process unfolded, though along a separate path. Land associated with the Australian continent, including regions that now form parts of New Guinea, became more connected during these periods of lower sea level. Here, too, ecosystems expanded across newly available ground, allowing species to spread within their own domain, shaped by a different evolutionary history. Between these two regions, however, the pattern broke. The deep channels that lie beneath the present-day boundary did not disappear with the falling seas. Even at the lowest points of the ice ages, these passages remained submerged, their depths too great to be exposed. While the surrounding areas transformed, revealing land where there had once been water, this central divide persisted, unbroken and hidden beneath the surface. This meant that the land bridges formed on either side never met. The expanded territories of Asia and Australia approached one another, but they did not connect. A gap remained, narrow in distance yet absolute in its effect. Animals that could roam freely across vast newly joined landscapes were still unable to cross this final separation. Over the course of multiple ice ages, this pattern repeated. Sea levels rose and fell in cycles, reshaping coastlines and altering the distribution of land and water. Each time the oceans receded, opportunities for movement expanded across much of the region. Each time, the same deep boundary remained intact, preventing the merging of two distinct biological worlds. The persistence of this divide during periods of such dramatic change strengthened its influence. While other boundaries dissolved under shifting conditions, this one endured, maintaining a separation that became more pronounced with each cycle. Species on either side continued to evolve within their own expanding territories, their paths shaped by environments that, while sometimes changing, remained fundamentally separate. In this way, the ice ages did not erase the boundary, but reinforced it. They revealed how deeply it was rooted in the structure of the planet, how it resisted even the most significant changes in sea level. The visible landscape transformed again and again, yet beneath those changes, the same division held its place. When the ice retreated and the oceans rose once more, the islands returned to their present forms, separated once again by water. But the patterns established during those colder times remained, carried forward into the modern arrangement of life. The boundary, shaped by depths that never yielded to the shifting seas, continued to guide the distribution of species, a quiet constant through cycles of change. Long before the present arrangement of islands and seas, the ground itself followed a different pattern, one shaped by movements so slow that they leave no trace within a single lifetime. Continents were not fixed, but shifting, carried across the surface of the planet by forces deep within the earth. Over immense stretches of time, these movements brought land masses together and then drew them apart, altering the paths along which life would evolve. Asia and Australia were once part of broader configurations, their positions defined by ancient connections that no longer exist. As tectonic plates moved, driven by the gradual flow of material beneath the crust, these regions began to separate. The process unfolded over millions of years, creating distances that expanded slowly but persistently, allowing each landmass to follow its own course. This separation did not occur in isolation. The region that now forms the Indonesian archipelago became a zone of interaction between these shifting plates, where fragments of land rose, collided, and rearranged themselves. Volcanic activity and uplift added new islands, while subsidence and erosion reshaped others. The result was a complex mosaic, a landscape formed not by a single event, but by the accumulation of many changes layered over deep time. Within this evolving structure, the separation between Asia and Australia remained a defining feature. As the two regions moved apart, the connection between their ecosystems diminished. Populations that once shared a continuous range found themselves divided, their interactions gradually reduced until they ceased altogether. Isolation began to take hold, not as an abrupt break, but as a slow widening of distance that limited the exchange of life. Over generations, this isolation allowed species on each side to follow distinct evolutionary paths. In Asia, the development of placental mammals continued along one trajectory, shaped by environmental conditions and ecological interactions unique to that region. In Australia and its surrounding lands, a different pattern emerged, one where marsupials and monotremes diversified, filling roles that elsewhere were occupied by entirely different groups. These divergences were not simply variations on a theme. They represented fundamentally different approaches to survival and adaptation, each shaped by the conditions present within its own domain. As time passed, the differences deepened, reinforced by the absence of contact and the ongoing influence of local environments. The boundary that would later be recognized as the Wallace Line has its origins in this ancient separation. It reflects not just the current arrangement of islands, but the deeper history of how these landmasses came to be positioned as they are. The line follows the edge of a meeting point between tectonic plates, where the geological history of the region has created a lasting division. Even as smaller fragments of land shifted and new islands formed, the underlying separation between the Asian and Australian realms persisted. The movement of plates did not erase this division, but rather shaped it into the complex pattern seen today. The archipelago became a place where these two worlds approach one another, yet remain distinct, their histories preserved within the distribution of life. This deep-time perspective reveals that the boundary is not a recent feature, but one rooted in processes that extend far beyond human observation. The arrangement of species across the islands is the present expression of events that began millions of years ago, carried forward through countless generations. In the slow drift of continents, the foundations of the divide were laid. What appears now as a line across water is, in truth, the surface expression of a much older story, one written in the movement of the Earth itself. The separation of Asia and Australia, shaped by tectonic forces and sustained over immense spans of time, continues to guide the patterns of life, linking the present to a distant and enduring past. Separation does not need to be dramatic to shape the course of life. It can begin quietly, with a population divided by distance or water, each group continuing its existence without awareness of the other. At first, the differences are subtle, almost imperceptible, carried in small variations that accumulate over generations. With time, those variations deepen, guided by the distinct conditions each group encounters. On either side of the boundary, this process has unfolded over immense spans of time. Species that share a distant common ancestry have followed separate paths, responding to environments that, while similar in appearance, differ in ways that matter for survival. Food sources, predators, climate patterns, and even the structure of vegetation create pressures that shape behavior and form. Each adaptation reflects a response to these pressures, a gradual adjustment that becomes more pronounced with each generation. In isolation, these changes are not diluted by constant mixing. When populations remain connected, new traits can spread across a wide area, blending differences and maintaining a degree of uniformity. When that connection is broken, each group evolves within its own context, allowing divergence to proceed without interruption. Over time, this leads to the emergence of distinct characteristics, some subtle, others more visible. On the western side, the evolutionary trajectory has favored the development of placental mammals with complex reproductive strategies, allowing offspring to develop within the body before birth. This approach supports certain forms of growth and survival, shaping how species interact with their environment. Predators and prey co-evolve, refining their abilities in response to one another, creating intricate ecological relationships that define the structure of the ecosystem. Across the boundary, a different set of solutions has taken hold. Marsupials, with their unique reproductive approach, give birth to relatively undeveloped young that continue their growth within a pouch. This strategy leads to forms and behaviors that differ from those of placental mammals, even when occupying similar ecological roles. Monotremes, more ancient still, represent an alternative path, combining traits that seem to bridge different stages of mammalian evolution. These differences are not simply variations in appearance. They reflect deeper divergences in physiology, development, and adaptation. Each side of the boundary has become a repository of evolutionary experiments, shaped by isolation and refined through time. The absence of competition from certain groups has allowed others to expand into niches that might otherwise be occupied, further reinforcing the uniqueness of each ecosystem. Isolation also influences smaller organisms, where rapid generation times accelerate the pace of change. Insects, plants, and microorganisms adapt to local conditions, their variations accumulating quickly and contributing to the overall diversity of the region. The boundary becomes a line along which different evolutionary stories unfold, each side developing its own complexity. The result is not just a division, but an amplification of diversity. By preventing the constant mixing of populations, isolation allows for the exploration of different possibilities, leading to the emergence of forms that might not arise in a more connected system. Over millions of years, this process creates ecosystems that are rich in unique species, each shaped by the specific conditions of its environment. In this way, separation becomes a creative force. It does not simply limit movement, but directs the course of evolution, guiding the development of life along different paths. The boundary, though unseen, marks a place where these paths diverge, where the history of life branches into distinct trajectories. Within the quiet persistence of this division, the archipelago reveals how deeply isolation can influence the living world. Each species, in its form and behavior, carries the imprint of that separation, a record of the long process through which new forms of life emerge when connection is gently but consistently held apart. A boundary does not always rise in height or stretch across the horizon to be effective. Sometimes it exists in a form so subtle that it passes unnoticed, shaping movement not through force, but through quiet resistance. In the spaces between these islands, the barriers that matter most are often the least visible, woven into the conditions that guide how life moves and where it settles. A narrow channel of water may appear insignificant when measured by distance alone, yet for many species, it represents a limit that is rarely crossed. The difficulty does not lie only in the act of reaching the other side, but in the chain of events required for that crossing to lead to something lasting. Movement must be followed by survival, and survival must be followed by the ability to reproduce and establish a stable presence. Each step introduces its own constraints, and together, they create a barrier that is far more effective than its physical dimensions might suggest. Ocean currents play a quiet role in this process, guiding what is carried and what is left behind. Water does not remain still between islands. It flows, sometimes steadily, sometimes unpredictably, shaping the paths along which organisms might travel. For some, these currents provide an opportunity, carrying seeds, insects, or small animals across distances they could not traverse on their own. For others, the same currents act as a force of separation, pulling them away from potential destinations or dispersing them into environments where survival is unlikely. The depth of the water adds another layer to this subtle structure. Even when the surface distance is small, the underlying depth can prevent the formation of conditions that would otherwise support movement. Shallow areas may allow for temporary connections during periods of environmental change, but deep channels remain constant, preserving separation across cycles that alter much of the surrounding landscape. This persistence reinforces the boundary, ensuring that it endures even as other factors shift. Ecological differences, often slight and easily overlooked, further strengthen these divisions. Variations in vegetation, soil composition, or microclimate can influence whether a species can adapt to a new environment. An animal or plant that arrives on a neighboring island may find that the conditions do not align with its needs, limiting its ability to survive beyond a short period. These differences do not need to be extreme to be effective. Even small mismatches can prevent the establishment of new populations, maintaining the distinct character of each ecosystem. Over time, these subtle forces accumulate. Each unsuccessful crossing, each failed attempt at establishment, reinforces the separation. The boundary is not maintained by a single obstacle, but by the combined effect of many small constraints, each contributing to a pattern that becomes stable over generations. What might seem like a minor gap in one moment becomes, through repetition, a lasting division. This reveals a broader principle within the natural world. Barriers do not need to be dramatic to shape the course of life. They can operate quietly, influencing movement and distribution through conditions that are not immediately visible. The effectiveness of a boundary lies not in its size, but in how consistently it limits the processes that would otherwise lead to connection. In the archipelago, these small barriers work together to maintain the separation that defines the region. Currents, depth, and ecological variation form a network of influences that guide where species can and cannot persist. Over millions of years, this network has shaped the distribution of life with a precision that mirrors that of more obvious divisions. Within this quiet framework, the unseen becomes powerful. The forces that shape the living world operate without spectacle, yet their effects are enduring. Each island, in its distinct composition, reflects the influence of these subtle boundaries, showing how even the smallest constraints, applied over time, can define the arrangement of life across an entire region. Water is rarely still, even when its surface appears calm. Beneath that quiet exterior, motion continues in layered paths, guided by wind, temperature, and the rotation of the planet. In the seas that wind through the archipelago, these movements form a complex system of currents, flowing between islands with a rhythm that shapes what is carried and what is left behind. These currents do not move in a single direction. They shift with seasons, deepen or weaken with changing conditions, and follow routes defined by the contours of the seafloor. Some flow steadily along predictable paths, while others turn and disperse, creating patterns that are difficult to trace from above. Together, they form a network of movement that connects distant points, yet also introduces subtle forms of separation. For small and lightweight organisms, these currents can act as pathways. Seeds, fragments of plants, and even certain insects may be lifted into the flow and transported across open water. Floating debris becomes a temporary vessel carrying life from one island to another. In these moments, the sea serves as a bridge, allowing species to reach new shores without the need for deliberate movement. Yet this process is uneven, shaped by chance and by the nature of the organisms themselves. Not everything that enters the current is carried to a suitable destination. Many are drawn into routes that lead away from land, dispersing into open ocean where survival becomes unlikely. Others may arrive on unfamiliar shores only to encounter conditions that do not support their needs, preventing them from establishing a lasting presence. Larger animals face a different set of challenges. For them, the currents are not a means of transport, but a force to be resisted. Swimming across even short distances requires energy and endurance, and the movement of water can either assist or hinder that effort. A favorable current may shorten the journey, while an opposing one can extend it beyond what is possible to complete. These dynamics influence whether a crossing can occur at all, and whether it can be repeated often enough to allow populations to form. The direction of flow also plays a role in shaping patterns of dispersal. Currents that consistently move away from a boundary can reduce the likelihood of organisms reaching the opposite side, even if the distance is small. In contrast, currents that circulate within a region may encourage movement within that space, reinforcing connections among certain islands while limiting interaction with others. Over time, these tendencies contribute to the distribution of species, guiding where life can spread and where it remains contained. Temperature and salinity, carried within these moving waters, further influence the environments that develop along their paths. They affect the availability of nutrients, the composition of marine life, and the conditions experienced by coastal ecosystems. These factors extend beyond the ocean itself, shaping the habitats found on land and influencing which species can thrive. In this way, currents become more than simple movements of water. They act as subtle architects of distribution, directing the flow of life in ways that are not immediately visible. Their influence is continuous, operating across seasons and generations, reinforcing patterns that align with the broader structure of the region. Within the quiet persistence of these flows, the boundary finds another layer of support. The sea, through its motion, both connects and separates, offering pathways that are selective rather than universal. Some forms of life are carried along these routes, while others remain confined to their side, shaped by the interaction between movement and limitation. As the currents continue their steady motion, they contribute to the arrangement of ecosystems across the archipelago. Their paths, though unseen, leave an imprint on the distribution of species, guiding the spread of life with a precision that emerges only over time. Air moves differently on either side of the boundary. Though the change is so gentle, it rarely draws attention. The same sun passes overhead, the same seasons unfold in steady rhythm, yet the patterns of rainfall and temperature begin to shift in quiet ways. These differences do not reshape the landscape in obvious forms, but they influence the conditions that life depends on, guiding which species can take hold and which remain confined. Moisture arrives with varying intensity, carried by winds that follow paths shaped by geography and ocean movement. Some regions receive consistent rainfall, sustaining dense vegetation that thrives in near constant humidity. Others experience more variation, with periods of relative dryness that alter the timing of growth and the availability of resources. These shifts may appear minor, yet for many organisms, even small changes in water availability can influence survival. Temperature follows a similar pattern, remaining broadly warm across the region, but differing in subtle gradients. Slight variations in average conditions or in the range between day and night can affect metabolic processes, breeding cycles, and the distribution of plants that form the foundation of ecosystems. These climatic nuances create environments that, while outwardly similar, function in distinct ways for the species that inhabit them. Plants respond first to these differences, adjusting their growth to match the conditions they encounter. Certain species thrive where rainfall is abundant and consistent, while others are better suited to environments with more fluctuation. The composition of vegetation begins to diverge, shaping the structure of forests and the resources they provide. This, in turn, influences the animals that depend on those plants for food, shelter, or reproduction. For animals, adaptation to climate involves more than tolerance. It requires alignment with the timing of seasonal changes, the availability of food, and the presence of suitable habitats. A species that evolves under one set of conditions may find it difficult to adjust to even slightly different circumstances. The difference may not be immediately visible, but it can affect the success of feeding, the survival of offspring, or the ability to compete with other species already established in the environment. When individuals cross into a new region, these climatic factors act as a form of environmental filtering. Arrival alone does not ensure persistence. The new conditions must support every stage of the life cycle, from development to reproduction. If any part of that cycle is disrupted, the population cannot sustain itself. Over time, this filtering process maintains the distinct composition of ecosystems on either side of the boundary. The effect accumulates gradually. Each generation that fails to establish reinforces the separation, while those that remain continue to adapt more closely to their local conditions. The divergence between regions deepens, not through abrupt change, but through the steady influence of climate acting over long periods. These subtle differences also interact with other forces, such as ocean currents and geological features, creating a network of influences that shape the distribution of life. Climate does not act in isolation, but as part of a broader system that guides how species move and where they can survive. Together, these factors create a pattern that remains consistent even as individual conditions fluctuate. In this quiet interplay, the boundary becomes more than a line of separation. It reflects a shift in the environmental context, one that influences the course of evolution and the arrangement of ecosystems. The changes in rainfall and temperature, though modest, contribute to a larger framework that defines where species can persist. Across the archipelago, the air carries these differences without announcing them. The forests grow, the animals move, and life continues within the conditions set by climate. Over time, these conditions shape the boundaries that remain, guiding the distribution of species with a precision that emerges only through the accumulation of many small influences. Not every pattern in the living world is guided by steady forces alone. Alongside climate, geography, and time, there is another influence, quieter and less predictable, shaping which species take root and which remain absent. It does not follow a plan or direction. It emerges from events that occur without intention, yet leave lasting marks on the distribution of life. A storm may carry fragments of vegetation across open water, and within those fragments, small organisms may survive the journey. A group of animals might reach a distant shore by chance, arriving not through gradual expansion, but through a single, unlikely crossing. These moments are rare, but when they occur, they introduce new possibilities, placing life in locations it might never have reached through ordinary movement. What happens next depends on more than arrival. A small number of individuals, often referred to as a founder population, carries only a fraction of the genetic variation present in its original group. This limited starting point shapes the future of the population in subtle ways. Traits that were once rare may become common, not because they offer an advantage, but because they happen to be present in those first individuals. In isolation, these effects become amplified. Without regular contact with the original population, there is no steady flow of new genetic material to balance these initial conditions. The traits carried by the founders persist and spread, forming the basis of a distinct lineage. Over time, this process can lead to differences that extend beyond appearance, influencing behavior, physiology, and adaptation to the local environment. Chance also determines Which species attempt or succeed in crossing boundaries? Many organisms may never encounter the conditions needed to leave their original range. Others may attempt to move, but fail to survive the journey. Only a small number experience the combination of factors that allows them to arrive and establish themselves. This uneven distribution of opportunity contributes to the patterns observed across the archipelago. The boundary reflects these accumulated outcomes. It is not only maintained by barriers, but also shaped by the history of which species happened to cross and which did not. Some groups may have had opportunities that others never encountered. Some arrivals may have succeeded under conditions that no longer exist. These moments, though isolated in time, leave enduring traces in the structure of ecosystems. Over millions of years, the influence of chance becomes woven into the broader pattern. It does not replace the effects of climate or geography, but interacts with them, adding variation to an already complex system. The result is a distribution of life that cannot be fully predicted from present conditions alone. It carries the imprint of past events, many of which were singular and unlikely. This unpredictability gives the boundary a certain depth. It is not a simple line drawn by consistent forces, but a record of countless interactions between constraint and possibility. Each species, in its presence or absence, reflects a history shaped partly by circumstance, by the outcomes of events that could have unfolded differently. Even within a stable environment, chance continues to play a role. New opportunities arise, conditions shift, and rare movements occur. Most leave little trace, but occasionally they alter the course of a population, introducing new elements into the pattern. These changes are often subtle, unfolding slowly, yet they contribute to the ongoing evolution of the system. In this quiet interplay, the distribution of life becomes a balance between order and unpredictability. The boundary remains clear, yet within it lies a history shaped not only by consistent forces, but by moments of chance that have guided the paths of species across time. No boundary in nature is drawn with complete precision. Even where patterns appear consistent, there are always small deviations, moments where the expected arrangement softens and allows for variation. Along this invisible division, the same principle holds. The separation remains clear, yet it is not without exceptions, small threads that cross the line and remind us that living systems are rarely absolute. Certain species appear on both sides, their presence extending beyond the boundary that confines so many others. Some birds maintain populations that span the divide, their ranges shaped by behaviors or ecological flexibility that allow them to persist in differing conditions. A few insects, carried by wind or drifting materials, have established themselves in new locations, adapting to environments that differ from those of their origin. Even among plants, there are cases where seeds have taken root beyond their usual range, finding conditions that support their growth. These instances do not erase the boundary. Instead, they exist within it, small variations that highlight the overall pattern rather than contradict it. The line remains visible through the broader distribution of life, defined by the many species that adhere to it, even as a few extend beyond its limits. The ability to cross and persist depends on a combination of traits. Species that succeed often possess a degree of ecological flexibility, allowing them to adapt to a wider range of conditions. Their diets may be varied, their habitats less specific, and their reproductive strategies more resilient to change. This flexibility increases the likelihood that, once they arrive in a new environment, they can establish a stable presence. Dispersal mechanisms also play a role. Some organisms are more easily transported across water, whether through flight, drifting, or other means. These modes of movement do not guarantee success, but they increase the chances of reaching new areas. When combined with the ability to adapt, they create opportunities for expansion beyond the usual limits. Yet even for these species, the boundary continues to influence their distribution. Populations that exist on both sides may show subtle differences shaped by the conditions of their respective environments. Over time, these differences can grow, leading to divergence even within a species that appears to cross the line. The boundary, though not absolute, still guides the direction of change. The presence of exceptions also reflects the dynamic nature of ecosystems. Conditions shift, opportunities arise, and the distribution of life responds in ways that are not always predictable. A rare event may allow a species to establish itself beyond its usual range, and if the conditions remain favorable, that presence can persist. These moments add complexity to the pattern, creating layers of variation within the broader structure. Understanding this nuance is essential to appreciating the nature of the boundary. It is not a rigid barrier that prevents all movement, but a strong influence that shapes the overall arrangement while allowing for occasional variation. The line exists as a tendency, a consistent pattern that emerges from the interaction of many factors, rather than as an unbreakable rule. In this way, the exceptions become part of the story. They reveal the flexibility within the system, the capacity for life to move and adapt under certain conditions. At the same time, they emphasize the strength of the forces that maintain the separation, showing how rare such crossings remain in comparison to the broader pattern. The archipelago, through these subtle variations, reflects a balance between stability and change. The boundary holds its form, guiding the distribution of life, yet within it, there is room for divergence and adaptation. This interplay adds depth to the pattern, allowing it to remain both consistent and responsive, shaped by forces that operate across different scales and moments in time. Across the surface of the planet, boundaries appear in many forms, though most leave no mark that can be seen directly. They are traced instead through the distribution of life, revealed by where species begin and where they quietly give way to others. These divisions, known as biogeographical boundaries, emerge from the same interplay of isolation, environment, and time, shaping the living world into distinct regions that reflect deeper histories. In Africa, the gradual transition from dense tropical forests to open savannas marks a shift in the communities of animals and plants that can persist. In the Americas, mountain ranges and deserts create divisions that separate species into distinct ecological zones. Even within oceans, changes in temperature and currents define regions where certain forms of marine life thrive, while others remain absent. Each of these boundaries reflects a combination of factors, some visible, others hidden beneath the surface. These divisions are not always sharp. In many places, they form broad transition zones where species overlap, creating areas of blending rather than abrupt change. Life adjusts gradually, responding to shifting conditions in ways that soften the edges between regions. These zones reveal the fluid nature of ecosystems where boundaries exist but allow for a degree of continuity. The Wallace Line stands apart from many of these examples because of its clarity. While other boundaries often stretch across wide areas marked by gradual transitions, this one appears with unusual precision. The shift in species occurs over relatively short distances, without the extended zones of overlap that might be expected. This distinctness gives the line a particular significance, highlighting the strength of the forces that maintain it. Scientists have sought to understand and map these patterns by studying the distribution of species across the globe. Through careful observation, they identify regions where life follows a consistent structure, grouping areas into biogeographical zones that reflect shared histories. These zones are not defined by political or geographical boundaries, but by the living communities they contain. Modern techniques have expanded this understanding, allowing researchers to analyze genetic relationships and trace the movements of species over time. By comparing DNA, scientists can identify connections between populations that may appear separate, revealing how they have diverged or remained linked. Fossil evidence adds another layer, providing insight into past distributions and how they have changed across geological time. Through these methods, the invisible lines that shape the living world become more apparent. They are mapped not with straight edges, but with patterns that reflect the complexity of natural systems. Each boundary tells a story of separation and connection, of forces that guide where life can spread and where it remains confined. The Wallace Line, within this broader context, serves as a particularly vivid example. Its clarity makes it easier to observe, but the processes that created it are not unique. They are part of the same mechanisms that operate across the planet, shaping the distribution of species in ways that are both subtle and profound. By studying these patterns, scientists gain insight into the history of the Earth and the processes that continue to influence it. The arrangement of life becomes a record of past events, a reflection of how continents have moved, climates have changed, and species have adapted. Each boundary contributes to this record, adding detail to a larger picture that spans the entire planet. In the quiet presence of these divisions, the world reveals a structure that is not immediately visible. The lines that separate regions of life exist without physical markers, yet they guide the distribution of species with remarkable consistency. The Wallace Line, though one among many, remains a striking example of how these unseen boundaries shape the living world, offering a glimpse into the deeper patterns that define life on Earth. In quiet laboratories far from the islands themselves, the boundary continues to be traced in new ways, not through the collection of visible forms alone, but through patterns hidden within cells and sequences that record the history of life. What once required years of travel and observation can now be examined at a scale that reaches into the smallest details, revealing connections that were previously impossible to see. DNA carries within it a record of ancestry, a sequence that reflects how species are related and how they have changed over time. By comparing these sequences across populations, scientists can reconstruct pathways of divergence, identifying where groups began to separate and how long they have remained apart. In the context of the boundary, these genetic comparisons reveal a consistent pattern, with species on either side showing clear distinctions that align with the division first observed through physical characteristics. These analyses extend beyond simple classification. They allow researchers to estimate the timing of separation, linking genetic divergence to geological and climatic events. In doing so, they provide a deeper understanding of how the boundary has persisted across changing conditions, connecting present distributions to processes that unfolded over millions of years. Mapping technologies add another layer to this work. With precise geographic data, scientists can track where species are found, creating detailed distributions that reveal how closely they adhere to the boundary. These maps do not rely on a single observation, but on the accumulation of many records, each contributing to a clearer picture of how life is arranged across the region. Patterns emerge through this process, showing not only where species are present, but where they consistently stop. Movement is also studied in new ways. Some species are monitored directly, their paths recorded through tagging and tracking technologies that follow their journeys across land and water. These observations provide insight into how individuals move within their environment and how often they approach or cross the boundary. While such crossings can occur, the data often show that they are limited in their long-term impact, reinforcing the stability of the divide. Other approaches focus on indirect evidence, examining how species spread over time. By studying the distribution of genetic variation within populations, scientists can infer patterns of movement and expansion, identifying regions where dispersal has occurred and where it has been constrained. These patterns often align with the boundary, highlighting its role in shaping the flow of life. Fossils offer a perspective that extends further into the past. Preserved remains provide snapshots of earlier distributions, showing how species were arranged under different conditions. By comparing these records with present patterns, researchers can trace the continuity of the boundary, observing how it has persisted even as environments and sea levels have changed. The fossil record, though incomplete, adds depth to the understanding of how long this division has influenced the living world. Together, these methods create a layered view of the boundary, one that combines present observations with historical evidence. The line becomes more than a surface pattern, emerging as a feature supported by multiple forms of data, each reinforcing the others. What was once identified through careful observation now stands confirmed through a wide range of approaches, each adding detail to the original insight. In this ongoing work, the boundary remains a subject of quiet investigation. New techniques continue to refine the understanding of how it operates, revealing complexities that extend beyond its initial discovery. The tools may have changed, but the focus remains the same, an effort to understand how life is distributed and why certain divisions endure. Through this combination of methods, the invisible line becomes increasingly defined, not through direct visibility, but through the convergence of evidence. Each dataset, each analysis, contributes to a clearer picture, showing how deeply the boundary is embedded within the patterns of life and how it continues to shape them in the present. Stone holds its own quiet memory, one that does not fade with the passing of seasons or the shifting of coastlines. Within layers of sediment, the remains of ancient life rest in place, preserved in forms that speak without movement. These fossils offer a record that reaches far beyond the present arrangement of islands, revealing patterns that were already forming long before the modern landscape took shape. Across the region, fossil discoveries show that the separation observed today is not a recent development. Remains of animals found on one side align closely with lineages tied to Asia, while those on the other reflect connections to Australia and surrounding lands. These patterns appear consistently within the geological record, suggesting that the division between these biological worlds has deep roots, extending back through vast spans of time. The fossils do not form a continuous narrative in every detail. They appear in fragments scattered across different locations and layers, each offering a glimpse rather than a complete picture. Yet when these pieces are brought together, a pattern emerges that mirrors the boundary seen in living species. The same distinction, present in the modern distribution of life, can be traced into earlier periods, indicating that the forces shaping this division have been active for millions of years. In some cases, fossils reveal species that once occupied areas where they are no longer found. These records provide clues about past movements, suggesting that under certain conditions, species expanded beyond their current ranges. Changes in climate, shifts in sea levels, or the formation of temporary connections may have allowed these movements to occur. Over time, however, many of these expansions did not persist, and the boundary reasserted itself, limiting the long-term spread of these species. Extinction also plays a role in shaping the fossil record. Species that once existed on one side of the boundary may have disappeared entirely, leaving behind only their preserved remains. These absences add complexity to the pattern, showing that the distribution of life is influenced not only by movement and isolation, but by the loss of lineages over time. The boundary, in this sense, reflects both what has endured and what has been lost. The persistence of the division across such deep history suggests that it is anchored in factors that remain stable over long periods. Geological structures, ocean depths, and the arrangement of land masses have maintained conditions that continue to influence the distribution of life. Even as environments have changed, these underlying features have provided continuity, allowing the boundary to endure. Fossils also reveal the gradual nature of these processes. The differences between species on either side did not appear suddenly, but developed over extended periods. Small variations accumulated, shaped by isolation and adaptation, until they became distinct enough to define separate communities. The fossil record captures moments within this progression, showing stages of divergence that lead to the patterns observed today. Through these preserved remains, the boundary becomes more than a feature of the present. It is seen as part of a long continuum, a structure that has guided the evolution and distribution of life across changing conditions. Each fossil contributes to this understanding, adding depth to the narrative of how species have moved, adapted, and sometimes disappeared. In the stillness of stone, the past remains present. The boundary, though invisible, leaves its imprint in these ancient records, confirming that its influence extends far beyond the current arrangement of islands. It has persisted through cycles of change, shaping the living world across time and leaving behind a trace that can be read in the layers of the earth itself. Ships began to move between these islands long before the boundary was understood, carrying not only people and goods, but quiet passengers hidden within cargo, wood, and soil. With each journey, new pathways opened, not shaped by currents or chance alone, but by deliberate movement guided by human intention. What had once been a slow and uncertain process of dispersal became faster, more frequent, and far less selective. Animals and plants that had never crossed the divide on their own began to appear in unfamiliar places. Some were carried intentionally, brought for food, labor, or cultivation. Others arrived unnoticed, traveling within shipments or clinging to materials moved from one island to another. These introductions did not follow the patterns that had shaped the region for millions of years. They bypassed the subtle filters of distance, depth, and environment, placing species directly into ecosystems where they had no prior history. At first, the effects could be difficult to detect. A newly arrived species might remain limited in number, its presence blending quietly into the existing landscape. Over time, however, certain introductions began to expand, establishing populations that interacted with native species in ways that had not occurred before. Predators encountered prey that had not evolved defenses against them. Competitors entered ecological niches already occupied, altering the balance that had developed through long periods of isolation. These changes do not always lead to immediate disruption, but they introduce new dynamics that can reshape ecosystems gradually. Some native species decline under increased pressure, their populations reduced by predation or competition. Others adapt, adjusting their behavior or range in response to the new conditions. The outcome varies, influenced by the specific interactions that unfold within each environment. The boundary itself becomes less distinct in these moments. Species that were once confined to one side appear on the other, not through natural expansion, but through human movement. The clear separation observed over generations begins to blur in certain areas, replaced by a more complex pattern that reflects both natural processes and human influence. The line remains present in the broader structure, but its clarity can be altered by these new connections. Plants play a significant role in this transformation as well. Seeds transported across regions may establish themselves in new soils, changing the composition of vegetation. This, in turn, affects the animals that depend on those plants, creating shifts that ripple through the ecosystem. The introduction of a single species can influence many others, altering relationships that have remained stable for long periods. The fragility of these systems becomes more apparent as these changes accumulate. Ecosystems that developed in isolation often lack the resilience to absorb sudden introductions. Their balance depends on interactions that have been refined over time, and the arrival of new species can disrupt these interactions in ways that are not easily reversed. Some changes persist, becoming part of the new structure, while others lead to the loss of species that cannot adapt. Human activity continues to shape these patterns, not only through direct movement, but through changes to land use and habitat. Forests are altered, environments are modified, and the conditions that support certain species shift accordingly. These influences add another layer to the distribution of life, interacting with the natural forces that have long defined the boundary. Within this evolving context, the boundary remains a reference point, a reminder of the underlying structure that once guided the arrangement of life with greater consistency. Its presence can still be observed, but it now exists alongside the effects of human movement, creating a more complex and dynamic pattern. The archipelago reflects this interplay, where ancient divisions persist even as new connections are formed. The balance between separation and interaction continues to shift, shaped by forces both natural and introduced, each leaving its imprint on the living world. Across these scattered lands, each island holds a quiet independence, shaped by its own conditions and histories, yet close enough to others to invite comparison. This combination creates a setting unlike most places on Earth, where patterns can be observed not in isolation, but across a series of natural variations. Islands become spaces where change can be traced more clearly, where the movement of life and the limits placed upon it leave visible marks. Their boundaries are simple, defined by water, yet the effects of those boundaries are profound. When populations arrive on an island, they often do so in small numbers, carrying only a portion of the genetic diversity from their original range. Once established, they remain separated, their future shaped by the conditions of that specific environment. Over time, these populations adapt in ways that reflect the resources available, the pressures they face, and the absence of influences that exist elsewhere. This process unfolds in parallel across many islands, each one offering a slightly different set of conditions. Some may be larger, supporting more complex ecosystems, while others remain small, with limited resources and fewer species. Elevation, rainfall, soil composition, and the presence or absence of predators all contribute to these differences. Together, they create a mosaic of environments where evolution can take multiple paths, each guided by local circumstances. Within this mosaic, patterns begin to emerge. Similar species may adapt in different ways depending on the island they inhabit, leading to a diversity of forms that share a common origin. These variations provide insight into how evolution responds to specific conditions, revealing the relationship between environment and adaptation. The changes are not random, but shaped by the interplay between inherited traits and the demands of the surroundings. The boundary that runs through this region adds another layer to this natural laboratory. It divides the archipelago into two broader contexts, each with its own evolutionary history. On either side, the same processes of isolation and adaptation occur, but they begin from different starting points. This creates an opportunity to observe how similar environments can produce distinct outcomes when shaped by different ancestral lineages. The Wallace Line, in this sense, becomes more than a boundary. It acts as a framework within which these parallel processes can be compared. The islands on each side provide examples of how life evolves under similar conditions, but from separate origins, highlighting the influence of history on the direction of change. The contrast between these regions offers a scale of observation that extends beyond individual islands, encompassing entire systems of life. Scientists study these patterns to understand the mechanisms that drive evolution. By examining how species differ across islands, they can identify the factors that influence adaptation, from resource availability to competition and environmental constraints. The simplicity of island systems, combined with their diversity, allows for clearer insights into processes that may be more complex in larger, more connected landscapes. Over time, these observations have contributed to a broader understanding of how life diversifies. Islands demonstrate how separation can lead to the emergence of new forms, how limited resources can shape behavior and structure, and how environmental pressures guide the development of species. They reveal that evolution is not a uniform process, but one that responds to the specific conditions in which it occurs. In the quiet arrangement of these islands, the study of life becomes a series of comparisons, each one adding detail to a larger picture. The boundary that runs through them enhances this perspective, providing a contrast that deepens the understanding of how different forces interact. Together, they form a living system of observation where the patterns of evolution can be seen not as isolated events, but as interconnected processes unfolding across space and time. At the margins of the boundary, there are moments where the pattern seems to hesitate, where the separation softens just enough to allow a presence to approach its limit. Certain species extend their range toward this edge, their distribution narrowing as they move closer to conditions that differ from those they are adapted to. These edges are not abrupt lines, but zones where persistence becomes more difficult, where survival is balanced against change. In some cases, populations appear on islands that lie very near the boundary, occupying spaces that bring them as close as possible without fully crossing. Their presence suggests that movement has occurred, that individuals have reached these areas through dispersal or gradual expansion. Yet their range often stops there, held in place by factors that prevent further spread. The boundary reveals itself not only in absence, but in the way these species gather at its edge and remain. Environmental pressures can encourage this movement. Changes in resource availability, competition, or habitat conditions may push populations to expand beyond their usual range. When conditions within their original environment become less favorable, the incentive to explore new areas increases. This expansion, however, is not unrestricted. It is guided by the ability of the species to cope with the conditions they encounter as they move outward. As these species approach the boundary, the environment begins to shift in ways that challenge their adaptation. The differences may be subtle: a change in vegetation, a variation in climate, or the presence of unfamiliar competitors. Each of these factors can influence whether a population can establish itself beyond its current range. Even when individuals reach a new area, the conditions may not support long-term survival, limiting their ability to persist. Some species manage to exist in these transitional spaces, adapting to a narrower set of conditions that allow them to occupy the edge. Their populations may be smaller or more fragmented, reflecting the constraints they face. Over time, these edge populations can develop traits that differ slightly from those found deeper within their range, shaped by the unique pressures of their environment. In other cases, attempts to cross the boundary leave only temporary traces. Individuals may arrive, survive for a short period, and then disappear, unable to establish a lasting presence. These brief appearances do not alter the overall pattern, but they indicate that the boundary is not an impenetrable barrier. It is a threshold where the likelihood of persistence decreases sharply, rather than a point that prevents all movement. The concept of the edge becomes important in understanding how the boundary functions. It is not defined solely by where species are absent, but by where they begin to struggle. The transition from one side to the other involves a shift in conditions that affects the balance between survival and limitation. Species that approach this edge reveal the gradual nature of the boundary, even as the broader pattern remains distinct. Over time, these near crossings contribute to the complexity of the system. They show that movement toward the boundary is possible, and that the limits are shaped by multiple factors working together. The persistence of the boundary depends not on the absence of movement, but on the rarity of successful establishment beyond it. Within these edge regions, the interplay between adaptation and constraint becomes more visible. Species extend their reach as far as their biology allows, meeting conditions that test the limits of their survival. Some adjust and remain, others retreat or disappear, and the boundary continues to hold its form through the accumulation of these outcomes. The archipelago, in these moments of near crossing, reveals a dynamic balance. The boundary is not static, but maintained through ongoing interactions between species and their environments. Each approach to the edge adds detail to this pattern, showing how life responds to the limits it encounters and how those limits shape the distribution that endures. Darkness settles quickly beneath the surface, and with it comes a depth that resists easy passage. In these waters, the separation between islands is not defined by distance alone, but by the sudden descent into spaces that remain beyond reach. What appears narrow at the surface conceals a vertical expanse that few terrestrial organisms can overcome, shaping the movement of life in ways that are not immediately visible. Deep water forms a barrier not through height or width, but through the conditions it creates. For land animals, the challenge begins the moment the shoreline ends. Swimming across open water requires energy, endurance, and the ability to navigate currents that may shift direction without warning. Even short distances become uncertain when there is no place to rest, no stable ground to pause the journey. The deeper the water, the less likely it is that any temporary support, such as exposed land or shallow passages, will exist to ease the crossing. In regions where the seafloor rises closer to the surface, changes in sea level can expose land bridges, allowing animals to move between areas that are now separated. These connections provide continuity, enabling species to expand their range gradually over time. Where the water remains deep, however, such bridges do not form. The separation persists, unaffected by the fluctuations that alter other parts of the landscape. This absence of connection has long-term consequences. Without a path of land, terrestrial animals cannot migrate in the slow, generational manner that defines much of their distribution elsewhere. Each crossing must occur as a singular event, dependent on rare circumstances rather than steady expansion. Even when individuals attempt the journey, the likelihood of success remains low, and the chances of establishing a lasting population beyond the crossing are lower still. The depth of the water also influences the surrounding environment in subtle ways. It shapes currents, affects the distribution of nutrients, and contributes to the conditions experienced at the surface. These factors, though indirect, reinforce the separation by influencing the ecosystems on either side. The barrier is not only physical, but part of a broader system that guides where species can persist. For smaller organisms, the challenge differs in form, but not in effect. While some may be carried across by chance, the depth ensures that these movements remain infrequent and unpredictable. Without consistent pathways, the establishment of stable populations becomes difficult, and the boundary remains intact. The ocean, in this sense, filters movement, allowing only occasional crossings that rarely alter the broader pattern. The persistence of deep water as a barrier is tied to the geological structure of the region. These channels are not temporary features, but part of the underlying framework of the Earth, shaped over millions of years. Their depth has remained sufficient to prevent connection even during periods when sea levels were significantly lower. This stability ensures that the separation they create is enduring, maintaining the distinction between biological communities across vast spans of time. Viewed from above, the ocean may appear as a continuous expanse, linking islands within a shared environment. Beneath that surface, however, it forms divisions that are both precise and lasting. The depth transforms what seems like a simple crossing into a boundary that shapes the distribution of life with quiet consistency. In this way, the ocean becomes a hidden wall, not built of stone or visible structure, but of conditions that limit movement and prevent connection. Its influence is constant, operating without interruption, guiding the arrangement of species across the archipelago. The islands remain close in appearance, yet separated by depths that ensure their living communities follow different paths, held apart by a barrier that remains unseen yet profoundly effective. Time moves without urgency, yet it reshapes the living world with a persistence that no sudden force can match. Across the archipelago, the boundary has not been formed by a single event, but by the accumulation of countless generations, each adding small changes that, together, create a lasting division. What began as separation has deepened through duration, becoming more defined with every passing era. In the early stages, differences between populations may have been slight, variations that reflected the beginnings of divergence rather than complete distinction. As isolation continued, these variations did not fade. Instead, they were carried forward, refined by environmental pressures and the absence of connection. Traits that suited local conditions became more common, while others disappeared, shaping each population in ways that aligned with its surroundings. Over millions of years, this process unfolds with quiet consistency. Each generation inherits the outcomes of those before it, building upon them in small increments. The pace may seem slow, almost imperceptible, yet the cumulative effect is profound. Populations that were once similar become increasingly distinct, their differences extending beyond surface characteristics into deeper aspects of biology and behavior. This gradual divergence affects entire ecosystems. As species adapt to their environments, they influence the conditions experienced by others, creating networks of interaction that evolve together. Predators and prey adjust in response to one another. Plants and pollinators develop relationships that shape their survival, and each change reinforces the structure of the system. Over time, These interactions create ecosystems that are cohesive within themselves, yet distinct from those found elsewhere. The boundary reflects the outcome of these long processes. It is not simply a line that separates species, but a point where entire systems of life differ in composition and function. Each side carries its own history, shaped by the conditions that have persisted there and by the absence of influences from the other side. The longer this separation endures, the more pronounced the differences become. Time also reduces the likelihood of change across the boundary. As ecosystems become more specialized, the conditions required for a species to establish itself in a new region become more specific. Adaptations that suit one environment may not translate easily to another, limiting the ability of species to cross and persist. This reinforces the separation, making it more stable as the systems on either side continue to develop independently. The accumulation of these changes creates a form of inertia. The longer a pattern exists, the more it is supported by the interactions within it. New introductions, whether through natural movement or external influence, encounter systems that are already well established, with relationships that resist disruption. The boundary, in this sense, becomes self-reinforcing, maintained not only by external factors, but by the internal coherence of the ecosystems it separates. Looking across the archipelago, the influence of time becomes visible in the depth of these differences. The distribution of species reflects histories that extend far beyond the present, shaped by processes that have operated continuously over immense spans. Each organism carries within it the result of this long development, a record of adaptation that aligns with its side of the boundary. In the steady passage of time, the separation has become more than a simple division. It has grown into a defining feature of the region, one that shapes the identity of its ecosystems. The boundary remains unseen, yet its presence is reinforced with each generation as evolution continues to build upon the distinctions that time has allowed to emerge. There are patterns that exist without ever announcing themselves, guiding the arrangement of life with a quiet consistency that becomes visible only through careful observation. The boundary that runs through these islands belongs to this kind of pattern, one that shapes the living world without leaving any mark upon the surface. It exists in the distribution of species, in the presence of some and the absence of others, forming a structure that can be traced but never directly seen. This idea alters the way the natural world is understood. It suggests that what appears continuous may, in fact, be divided by forces that operate beyond immediate perception. The forests on either side may seem alike, the climate may feel familiar, and the distance between islands may appear small, yet the living communities remain distinct. The difference lies not in what is visible, but in the underlying conditions that have guided their development over time. Such patterns invite a different kind of attention. They encourage a view of nature that looks beyond surface similarities, seeking the processes that shape outcomes over long periods. The boundary becomes a reminder that the organization of life is influenced by factors that are not always apparent, by histories and interactions that unfold slowly and leave their imprint in subtle ways. The power of these unseen forces lies in their persistence. They do not act through sudden change, but through steady influence, shaping the course of evolution and the distribution of species across generations. Each small constraint, each limitation on movement or survival, contributes to a larger pattern that becomes stable through repetition. Over time, this stability gives rise to divisions that appear as though they have always been present. This perspective also reveals a form of continuity within separation. The boundary does not exist in isolation, but as part of a broader system where different regions are connected through shared processes, even as they remain distinct. The same forces that create division also contribute to the diversity of life, allowing separate ecosystems to develop their own identities. The result is not fragmentation, but a structured variation where differences coexist within a larger framework. There is a quiet coherence in this arrangement. The patterns that emerge are not random, but reflect the interplay of geography, climate, time, and chance. Each element contributes to the whole, creating a distribution of life that, while complex, follows a discernible logic. The boundary is one expression of this logic, a line that reveals how these factors come together to shape the living world. In recognizing these patterns, the perception of nature shifts from a collection of isolated observations to a connected system where relationships extend beyond what can be directly observed. The unseen becomes an integral part of understanding, guiding the interpretation of what is visible. The absence of a physical marker does not diminish the reality of the boundary, but emphasizes the depth of the processes that sustain it. The archipelago, viewed through this lens, becomes more than a series of islands. It becomes a landscape defined by interactions that operate across scales, from the movement of continents to the adaptation of individual species. The boundary that runs through it is a reflection of these interactions, a line that exists because of the way these forces align. Within this quiet structure, there is a sense of balance. The divisions are not arbitrary, but arise from the conditions that shape life over time. Each side of the boundary holds its own patterns, its own forms, contributing to a broader diversity that reflects the complexity of the Earth itself. Life does not spread without limits. It moves outward, adapts, and persists, yet always within conditions that shape what is possible and what is not. Along this boundary, that principle becomes especially clear, not through dramatic obstacles, but through the quiet consistency of where species live and where they do not. The arrangement reflects a deeper truth, one that extends beyond this region into the broader patterns of the natural world. Every organism exists as a response to its environment. Its form, behavior, and way of surviving are shaped by the conditions it encounters over generations. Temperature, moisture, available food, and interactions with other species all contribute to this shaping, guiding the direction of adaptation. The result is a close alignment between life and the specific context in which it develops. When those conditions change, even slightly, the balance can shift. A species that thrives in one setting may struggle in another, not because it lacks the ability to move, but because its adaptations are finely tuned to a particular set of circumstances. The boundary reflects this sensitivity. It marks a point where environmental differences, though subtle, influence which forms of life can persist. Adaptation, in this sense, is not an unlimited process. It operates within constraints, guided by what is possible within the structure of an organism and the pace at which change can occur. While evolution allows for remarkable diversity, it does so gradually and always in response to existing conditions. Sudden shifts beyond those conditions can limit the ability of species to adjust, reinforcing the boundaries that define their range. Survival depends on this balance. Species must not only reach new environments, but also integrate into them, finding resources, avoiding threats, and reproducing successfully. Each of these steps is influenced by the surrounding conditions, and each can limit the expansion of a population. The boundary becomes a place where these limitations are most apparent, where the alignment between organism and environment determines whether persistence is possible. In this way, Boundaries define existence as much as they restrict it. They create spaces where particular forms of life can develop, shaping ecosystems that reflect the conditions within them. By limiting movement, they allow for the emergence of distinct communities, each adapted to its own context. Without these divisions, the diversity of life might be less pronounced, as constant mixing would reduce the differences that arise through isolation. The Wallace Line illustrates how these processes operate over long periods. It shows that the distribution of life is not random, but guided by a combination of factors that include environment, history, and the limits of adaptation. The boundary exists because these factors align in a way that maintains separation, even in the absence of visible barriers. This perspective extends beyond the specific region. It suggests that life everywhere is shaped by unseen constraints, by conditions that guide where species can exist and how they evolve. The patterns observed here are part of a larger system, one in which boundaries, both visible and invisible, play a central role in organizing the living world. Within this system, life continues to adapt, responding to changes in its environment while remaining influenced by the limits that define it. The balance between possibility and constraint shapes the diversity of forms that emerge, creating a world where variation is guided by structure. The boundary, though unseen, becomes a reminder of this balance. It reflects how life is both resilient and bounded, capable of remarkable adaptation, yet always shaped by the conditions in which it unfolds. Boundaries shaped by nature are rarely fixed in a permanent sense, even when they persist for immense stretches of time. They are held in place by conditions that can, under different circumstances, shift or transform. The line that separates these regions has endured through long periods of change, yet it remains part of a living system, one that continues to evolve alongside the world it organizes. Climate, over extended timescales, has the ability to reshape landscapes and the patterns within them. Variations in temperature and rainfall influence habitats, altering the distribution of vegetation and the availability of resources. As these conditions change, the environments that support certain species may expand, contract, or shift in location. These gradual movements can bring species closer to the boundary, adjusting the balance that has long maintained their separation. Sea levels, too, have fluctuated across history, rising and falling in response to global conditions. In periods of significant decline, land has emerged, in places now submerged, creating connections between regions that are currently isolated. While the deepest channels have resisted such exposure, even modest changes in sea level can alter the distances between islands, affecting the ease with which species might move. Over long durations, these shifts contribute to the dynamic nature of the boundary. Human influence adds another layer to this process, one that operates on a much shorter timescale. Through travel, trade, and the transformation of landscapes, new pathways are created that bypass natural constraints. Species are introduced into environments where they would not have arrived through natural dispersal, increasing the potential for mixing across the boundary. These movements do not erase the underlying structure, but they introduce new elements that can modify its expression. As species encounter new environments, some may establish themselves successfully, integrating into ecosystems that were once distinct. Others may fail to persist, limited by the same constraints that have shaped the boundary over time. The outcome of these introductions varies, influenced by the compatibility between the species and the conditions they encounter. Over extended periods, repeated introductions and environmental changes can lead to a gradual blending in certain areas. Despite these possibilities, the complete disappearance of the boundary would require more than occasional crossings or localized changes. It would involve a fundamental shift in the conditions that have maintained separation, altering the balance between movement and limitation. Such a transformation would depend on large-scale changes in climate, geography, or the structure of ecosystems, processes that unfold over long periods and through complex interactions. Even as these forces act, the boundary may persist in a modified form. It may shift in position, become less distinct in some regions, or evolve into a more gradual transition rather than a sharp division. The underlying factors that create differences between regions, such as historical separation and environmental variation, may continue to influence the distribution of life, even as the specific patterns change. The possibility of change does not diminish the significance of the boundary. Instead, it highlights its role as part of an ongoing process, one that reflects the interaction between stability and transformation. The line exists because of conditions that have aligned over time, and its future depends on how those conditions continue to evolve. Within this perspective, boundaries are not static features, but expressions of the current state of a system in motion. They mark where certain conditions meet and diverge, and they adapt as those conditions shift. The Wallace Line, though enduring, remains connected to the broader dynamics of the Earth, shaped by forces that extend beyond its immediate location. In the slow passage of time, the line may change, soften, or take on new forms, yet its presence, in some form, is likely to persist. As long as differences in environment and history continue to guide the distribution of life. There are divisions on this planet that leave no trace upon the ground, no ridge or wall to mark their presence, yet they guide the arrangement of life with quiet precision. The boundary that has unfolded across these islands is only one expression of a broader pattern, one in which separation arises not from visible obstacles, but from forces that operate beneath perception. These divisions exist within the fabric of the Earth itself, shaping where life can exist and how it evolves. Across different regions, similar boundaries appear in subtle forms. Changes in temperature across latitudes create zones where certain species thrive while others cannot persist. Variations in rainfall divide landscapes into distinct ecosystems, each supporting its own communities. Soil composition influences the plants that grow, and in turn, the animals that depend on them. None of these divisions are marked by clear lines, yet their effects are evident in the distribution of life. Gravity, constant and unobserved in its influence, shapes the structure of environments in ways that define possibilities. It governs the movement of water, the formation of mountains, and the flow of air, creating conditions that vary across space. These variations influence climate, which then shapes habitats, linking physical forces to biological outcomes. The result is a layered system where unseen influences guide visible patterns. Chemistry plays a similar role, operating at scales both large and small. The composition of the atmosphere affects temperature and weather, while the minerals within the soil determine what can grow. Even the chemistry of water influences which organisms can survive in it, creating distinctions between freshwater and marine environments. These chemical differences form boundaries that are as real as any physical barrier, directing the presence or absence of life. Climate, shifting over time, adds movement to these divisions. It changes gradually, altering the conditions that define ecosystems. As temperatures rise or fall, as rainfall patterns shift, the boundaries between regions can move, expanding or contracting in response. Species respond to these changes by adjusting their ranges, following the conditions that support their survival. The divisions remain, but their positions are not fixed, reflecting the dynamic nature of the forces that create them. Together, These influences form a network of invisible structures that shape the living world. They determine where species can establish themselves, how they interact, and how they change over time. The boundaries they create are not barriers in the traditional sense, but gradients and thresholds, places where conditions shift enough to influence what can persist. The absence of visible markers can make these divisions seem less real, yet their effects are profound. They guide the development of ecosystems, create diversity through separation, and maintain the balance between different forms of life. The patterns they produce are consistent, repeating across different regions and scales, revealing a deeper order within the apparent complexity of nature. In this context, the boundary within the archipelago becomes part of a larger story. It is one example of how unseen forces shape the distribution of life, reflecting the same principles that operate across the planet. Its persistence is not an anomaly, but a manifestation of the way the Earth organizes itself, through interactions that extend beyond what can be directly observed. The planet, viewed in this way, is divided not by walls, but by conditions. Each region is defined by a combination of factors that create a unique environment supporting particular forms of life. These divisions are fluid, changing over time, yet they remain structured, guided by the forces that shape the Earth. Within this quiet structure, life finds its place, adapting to the conditions that surround it and forming patterns that reflect the unseen boundaries that define them. Some of the most enduring features of the Earth are those that leave no visible trace, patterns that reveal themselves only through careful attention and time. The boundary traced across these islands stands as one of those quiet mysteries, a division that has guided life for millions of years without ever appearing on the surface. It is not marked by stone or elevation, yet it shapes entire ecosystems, separating worlds that exist side by side. Throughout this journey, the line has remained constant in its presence, even as the forces behind it have shifted and evolved. It has been shaped by deep geological history, by the movement of water and the passage of time, by the subtle interplay of environment and adaptation. Each layer of understanding adds depth to its meaning, revealing that what appears simple at first glance often carries a complexity that extends far beyond immediate perception. The boundary invites a different way of seeing the world, one that looks beyond what is visible and considers the processes that operate quietly in the background. It suggests that the patterns shaping life are not always dramatic or obvious, but can emerge from gradual influences that accumulate over long periods. In this way, the line becomes more than a geographical curiosity. It becomes a reflection of how the Earth organizes itself, through forces that are steady, persistent, and often unseen. There are many such patterns across the planet, each one contributing to the diversity of life and the structure of ecosystems. Some are recognized and studied, while others remain hidden, waiting to be observed and understood. The existence of this boundary serves as a reminder that the natural world still holds layers of complexity that extend beyond current knowledge, inviting continued exploration. As the narrative draws to a close, the line remains where it has always been, quiet and consistent, shaping the distribution of life without interruption. It continues to influence the paths of species, the composition of ecosystems, and the patterns that emerge across the archipelago. Its presence is subtle, yet its effects are profound, woven into the fabric of the living world. If this journey has brought a new perspective, there is space to reflect on which part of the story lingered most clearly, whether it was the depth of the ocean channels, the persistence of time, or the quiet influence of unseen forces. Each element contributes to a broader understanding, forming a picture that is both intricate and interconnected. Curiosity remains a guide through these patterns, encouraging a closer look at the details that shape the world. The unseen forces explored here are not isolated to this region, but extend across the planet, influencing environments in ways that are both subtle and far reaching. To continue observing these patterns is to deepen the understanding of how life and Earth are connected. If this exploration has been meaningful, consider supporting the continuation of these quiet journeys into science by engaging with the work, sharing it with others, and remaining part of a community that values careful observation and thoughtful reflection. There are many more stories to uncover, each one revealing another aspect of the intricate systems that define our planet. In the stillness of these patterns, the Earth continues its slow and steady unfolding, holding within it countless boundaries and connections, each contributing to the living world in ways that are both visible and hidden.